Our moderator tonight is John Stouffer, Harvard University Professor of English and American Literature and African American Studies, and Chair of the History of American Civilization program at Harvard. He's a leading authority on anti-slavery, social protest movements, and interracial friendship. He's the author of 8 books, including The Black Hearts of Men, Radical Abolitionists and the Transformation of Race from 2002, and more recently, Giants, The Parallel Lives of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln from 2008. Both of them won numerous awards, and I will not take time to list all of those awards right now. He is working on a new book about interracial friendship and another book about Frederick Douglass and visual culture.
Thank you very much. Welcome to Cambridge Forum, discussing Charles Sumner at 200, the tradition of civil rights in America. I'm John Stouffer. I should say that the project I'm working on right now is a biography of Charles Sumner with journalist Sally Jenkins, so I'm even more deeply invested in tonight's program than I would otherwise be, given my interest in abolition and anti-slavery. What I'd like to do is just give you a brief, roughly 30-second overview of Sumner's life, and then introduce our 2 speakers who will each give you a exhilarating formal presentation, after which, if there are pressing questions from you all, I will field the questions. If, as I suspect, it will require you to have some time to ruminate and digest the depth of the presentations, I'll begin by offering a question to start the conversation. Who was Charles Sumner, and why do we remember him? Sumner compiled a record of outstanding achievement in the anti-slavery movement of the 19th century. He entered the U.S. Senate as the national debate about the expansion of slavery was approaching a boiling point. Indeed, he soon discovered that debate was swiftly passing into violent action as he was beaten nearly to death by a Southern congressman in 1856. In essence, civil war entered the halls of Congress in 1856. Sumner, although he was severely injured and was out of the Senate for 4 years, his doctors worried that he would be permanently disabled. He did not succumb, returned to the Senate in 1860, and devoted the remainder of his public career to enhancing the civil rights of African Americans. He helped recruit more than 300,000 black soldiers following the Emancipation Proclamation. He helped to establish the Freedmen's Bureau to help former slaves that built 4,000 schools and 100 hospitals in the South and funded Howard University in Washington, D.C. He offered, in my view, the most astute problem or astute solution to the problem of Reconstruction when he advocated taking the 500 or 1,000 most powerful Confederate leaders and deporting them permanently to another country so that they could not cause any more harm and damage to the country. And he introduced the 1872 Civil Rights Bill, which was passed in 1875, really in honor of him after he died, which mandated equal accommodations in all public places. Without Sumner's contributions, how would the modern civil rights movement have been different? What parallels are there between Sumner's efforts on behalf of racial justice and modern Northern civil rights activists like the Freedom Riders of the 1960s? These are some of the questions our panelists will address as we honor Sumner's role in the past. Now let me introduce the panelists, and we'll move right into our presentations and then discussions. Daniel Coquillette is the Charles Warren Visiting Professor of American Legal History at Harvard University Law School and the J. Daniel Monin University Professor of Law at Boston University. He is director of the Harvard Law School History Project and is presently writing The Republic of Merit, the first volume of a 2-volume history of Harvard Law School in preparation for the school's bicentennial in 2017. Professor Coquillette's teaching and service to the legal community have focused on professional responsibility and legal ethics. He's widely published. If I listed his publications, we'd be here for a long time. His research and scholarly publications have examined in general English and American legal history. Beverly Morgan-Welch serves as the chief executive of the oldest and most visible African American history museum in New England, located on Boston's Beacon Hill in Nantucket. With 4 historic sites and collections that preserve the powerful past of African Americans from the colonial period through the abolition movement, the museum provides Black Heritage Trail tours, exhibits, and education programs that illuminate and share a liberating American history. Beverly's career spans 3 decades of experience in not-for-profit management and corporate philanthropy. She has also served the community as an active volunteer, serving as co-chairperson of the inauguration of the Honorable Deal Patrick, Governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and raising funds for the Bishop Desmond Tutu South African Refugee Scholarship Fund. She is a member of the Antiquarian Society, the Colonial Society of Massachusetts, and the Massachusetts Historical Society. First, we'll hear from Professor Coquillette of the Harvard Law School. Daniel.
Well, what an honor it is to be here today among some of my oldest friends, like Mayor Frank Duhay and Jim Shea of the National Park Service, of course, my distinguished colleague, John Stauffer, and naturally, Beverly Morgan-Welch, one of the great leaders in American museums and in the study of African American history. I have to only correct one thing that John said, because some of you, I think, might bleed maroon and gold. I'm the J. Donald Monin Society of Jesus professor at Boston College, not BU. That's a little different spin there. Charles Sumner was born almost exactly 200 years ago on January 6, 1811. If you walk out that door behind you, get on the MBTA in 20 minutes. Get off at Charles Street Station in 20 minutes. You will be at his birthplace on Irving Street. It is a place that established Bostonians at the time regarded as the wrong side of Beacon Hill. And his family was poor, desperately poor. His father was the sheriff of Suffolk County, but he just barely made ends meet, and his mother was a seamstress and helped make the family go with a Spartan budget. His dad didn't help his career very much. This is Charles Pinckney Sumner, by being one of the first opponents to the exclusion of black children from the Boston schools. Irving Street, on the wrong side of Boston, was in a historic black neighborhood. The African American Meeting House was right around the corner, and Charles Sumner grew up with black neighbors on all sides. Indeed, one of his earliest memories was the injustice that his black friends could not go to Boston Latin School with him. Sumner was a brilliant student. He graduated in 1830 from Harvard and in 1834 from Harvard Law School. He would have known this room, this very room. This is where graduation ceremonies took place. He would have known this building. He would have known that Emerson gave his great speech in this room. This is a room that Sumner would have known. He could have been the leader of the Harvard Law School. Joseph Story and Simon Greenleaf had picked him out as a young man. The law school in those days was just across the street where Lehman Hall is now, just beyond the MBTA station, Dane Hall. And Sumner was the student librarian to make money. And Story and Greenleaf and the leaders of the school had picked him out early as the potential replacement for Story himself. But after 1845, it was clear that Sumner had sacrificed his career in legal education for the principle of abolition. He was characterized as being rude, shrill, unreasoning, impolitic, extremist, not just as a young man, but through the Civil War, through his efforts in the Reconstruction of the South. In the Great War in history of Harvard Law School, he's regarded as an extremist, shrill. The Centennial history talks about how he was on the fringe. The Sutherland history of 1967, that's after the Civil Rights Movement, repeats the criticisms and says, of course, Sumner could not have become the dean of Harvard Law School because of his extremist views. Just this year, there's been another history of the Civil War that continues the attack on Sumner and blames Sumner, along with, quote, Southern romantics, for the Civil War as an avoidable war, that the war was avoidable if it hadn't been for Sumner and the extremists on the Southern side. They talk about Sumner as being his diatribes, his poor taste, his attack on Butler as unforgivable because of the sexual innuendos used. This is not 1845 or 1864, but 20,011. By the way, now we believe Butler did, in fact, have a black mistress. So Sumner was right on in every way. How long do you have to wait until history recognizes the truth about a controversial life? 50 years? No. 100 years? No. 150 years? Still no. This is one of the greatest men in American history. Why isn't he regarded as the same as Lincoln or other great leaders? Because of this continual attack, the cowardly caning by Preston Brooks. The interesting thing about that is not only was Preston Brooks never arrested, but that a number of towns and counties in the South have been named after Preston Brooks. I personally think we should have invited the mayor of Brooksville, Florida, to participate with us in this event, or Brooks County, Georgia. That would have been fun, right? Now here's another. The University of Virginia Debating Society presented Brooks with a gold-topped cane for beating that vulgar abolitionist. The University of Virginia is still there. I think they should have sent a representative as well to this event. We've said how Sumner was Story's choice, but the politics of the day and when his career was at the turning point were this. The establishment of Boston was very much in favor of the so-called Cotton Whigs. These are people who saw not only economic, but political self-interest in the status quo. When Sumner attacked the lords of the loom and the lords of the lash, he went right at the establishment, the corporation of Harvard University, the people that made the choices in this state. Many Bostonians, including the 3 professors at Harvard Law School, wished he had just shut up. I mean, their idea was to have maximum enrollment. 30% of the school came from the South. They were for abolishing slavery in Massachusetts. They were for abolishing slavery in New York. Therefore, in Maine, too. But every place where it had already been abolished, they were for it. They weren't going to touch slavery where in the Deep South. That was the whole idea. The peculiar institution. Emory Washburn across the street gave a speech and said, we must not make our fellow law students feel uncomfortable just because they come from a place with a peculiar institution. It's rude, it's discourteous to ask them about their plantations, about their slaves. Of course, the new territories, the spread of slavery into the new territories made this status quo untenable. Sumner saw early on that the Mexican War was going to open up new territories in the West to slavery, like Texas. He saw right away what Kansas meant and the fighting in Kansas and how you can't put the genie back in the bottle once until slavery begins to move like a cancer into those areas that were free. This is why the Civil War was not about states' rights. Please, if anybody wants to take me on, I'm ready. The Civil War was about slavery. was about slavery. One last thing about Sumner. He was a great leader in foreign relations, and as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee throughout the war, he kept the English and the French from siding with the Confederacy. It was a huge service to this country and showed his great intellectual ability. In Roberts against Boston, Sumner brought the first Brown against Board case. It was in 1853, and he argued unsuccessfully that school segregation in Boston was unconstitutional. That's 100 years before Brown against Board. In 1855, he obtained the legislation that for the first time permitted his black neighbors to go to the Boston schools. But just like his reputation has yet to be restored, so the progress against racism is glacial. The pictures of those burning buses serve to remind us that it's not just because Sumner continues to be attacked, but because his cause continues to be attacked, that he has not achieved his full greatness. When I was in college, and I'm from the Jurassic period, but I'm not that ancient, we had to cancel a Glee Club trip to Virginia because my classmate could not stay in the same hotel. That was 1965. It was only in 1967 that the Supreme Court ruled that the Virginia miscegenation law that Sumner hated so much was unconstitutional. 1967. Sumner fought against the Chinese Exclusion Acts and fought against racism in immigration policy. To this day, we're facing that, right now. In conclusion, Sumner said, the utopias of one age are the realities of another. But he, like Martin Luther King and other great reformers, knew that just doesn't happen automatically, but it involves great sacrifice. Both Sumner and King were prepared in the end to lay their lives down for their dreams. There is no greater service to racial equality, to American freedom, or to our great country than that. In the words of Longfellow, so when a great man dies, for years beyond our ken, the light he leaves before him lies upon the paths of men. The light of Sumner is on our path and forward into the centuries ahead.
Wow. That was wonderful. I almost forgot why I was here. It is my privilege to pay tribute and to speak of my admiration and affection for the sensational Senator Sumner, apostle of abolition, heralder of human rights and dignities, elevator of equal education, crusader for citizenship, and lawyer for the least and the last. He is a hero to be honored. Born 5 years after the African Meeting House was built on Beacon Hill, Sumner was awakened to a family of meager means, as you have heard. His father was an ardent anti-slavery activist who opposed anti-miscegenation laws, and his home on Irving Street was indeed on the north slope, not only the cold slope, but the wrong side of Beacon Hill. Sumner's neighbors were some of the first Africans in America purchasing property atop Beacon Hill. 3 Masons in the 1770s acquired property. Others lived in boarding houses in the homes of their enslavers or employers and created a community of purpose, organization, education, and engagement. Sumner saw the power of that organizational acumen in the African School, the African Benevolent Society, and the African Meeting House alone. He walked the streets with those who had been born to their freedoms, others who secured them by self-emancipation, stealing away, self-liberation, buying their way, and self-possession, claiming their way. There could have been little confusion for this young boy and man walking the pathways on Beacon Hill. He was illuminated by his interactions with blacks who had a tight-knit and elevating influence on their community. He was subject to the light of understanding his neighbors provided. While these pioneering black patriots struggled mightily, they were determined to secure their own freedoms, and they emerged as peacemakers, strategists, organizers, and leaders. They lived in a time that demanded their full engagement with the principles of independence, ingenuity, and individual rights and community responsibilities. They identified with the nation of their enslavement in its new Declaration of Independence and determined to extract those freedoms on behalf of their enslaved brothers and sisters. Sumner, the intellectual, well-traveled, fluent in multiple languages, returning to Boston to practice law in 1840, his friends and associates were part of his life. Not only Wendell Phillips and Justice Joseph Story, who was, by the way, part of the Supreme Court during the Amistad case, but these were the people of Beacon Hill. Most people don't know of the role of black abolitionists, but Charles Sumner had the advantage of being intimately acquainted with neighbors who were leaders in Black Boston and who were national movers and shakers. But neighborly relations aside, it was necessary to prove one's mettle. One of the ways of determining the mettle of those who would join the anti-slavery cause was through public oration. Orations are a Boston tradition, as you know. Here we are. They are also often a means of evaluating the aims, the ideology, and the stealth of the orator. William Lloyd Garrison, I point out Edith Garrison Griffin, one of my, I'm an honorary Garrison cousin. I'm sorry, I couldn't help but mention it, is here. William Lloyd Garrison, editor and publisher of the Liberator newspaper, underwent the scrutiny necessary to properly vet an emerging leader. His elevation to his status as a primary player came as a result of his interactions with the black community and its appointed leaders. They met with him and reviewed his readiness for a position at the helm of their cause to end slavery and to create a national movement. Sumner's 1845 Independence Day oration made him a cause célèbre. He was then invited to speak, and it was clear that he was going to be someone to be reckoned with. And like Garrison, his intellect, his clarity, his confidence in what was meet and right was a clarion call to a choice few. His voice began to rise and could be heard as an attorney advocating on behalf of justice. You've heard earlier about the Charles Sumner and Robert Morris joining forces in the Sarah Roberts case against the city of Boston. Probably the first time in this nation a black and a white attorney partnered on a legal case. While the two argued admirably for Sarah to be able to attend the Boston public school closest to her home, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court decided that the museum's Abiel Smith School was a separate but equal facility and education. This case and his activism were no accident. He had become a friend to justice and to black men and their collaborators in the cause. When Charles Sumner, William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and/or Lewis Hayden could not be found in their places of business or at the anti-slavery offices, they were found at John J. Smith's barbershop on Beacon Hill. Smith, born free in Virginia, had a successful Beacon Hill establishment, and Sumner was a patron and friend. That makes this an interracial barbershop. That barbershop did more than clip, trim, and provide a period spa treatment. It was a place where strategies were born and refined, where business was initiated and concluded, where newspapers were read and edited, and where those seeking freedom could find their way. What an education. What a curious cauldron of the complexity of this community within a community. To know the inner workings of Smith's barbershop was to understand the sacrifice and the promise of this new nation. The hypocrisy and the heights of the laws of this emerging democracy were dissected. Sumner knew the 5 black men who were the designated political leaders of their time. One of them was Mark Rene de Morty, who would become the sutler for the Massachusetts 54th Regiment during the Civil War, and he named his compatriots, Reverend Grimes, Lewis Hayden, Dr. John S. Rock, and Dr. J.B. Smith. They are members of the Free Soil Party, as was Sumner at the time, and they provide their votes in support of candidates for election prior to the Civil War. De Morty states, quote, after the election of their executive committee appointed a committee consisting of 3 members of the legislature, Dr. James M. Stone, Charles W. Slack, and John L. Swift, to wait upon us 5 previously named colored men to ask of us what we desired in behalf of the colored people. Our reply was mixed schools. Don't you like this? They're bargaining for their side, quid pro quo. We provide the votes. In turn, you end segregation in Boston schools. The committee said that they would do all in their power to have our request granted. Boston was then the only city in the state that had prescribed us in their schools. In January 1855, when the legislature met, a bill was introduced requiring all children to attend the schools in the wards in which they lived. In other words, Boston and the Commonwealth schools were desegregated. De Morty later continues, quote, when Charles Sumner was brutally assaulted by Congressman Preston Brooks of South Carolina in the United States Senate chamber, Ensign Burlingame, a congressman from Boston, denounced Brooks in such severe language for the cowardly act that Preston Brooks challenged Burlingame to fight a duel. Forces in Boston sympathizing with the South were determined to punish and defeat Burlingame. However, every day, De Morty and others canvassed the streets of Boston for 6 weeks and secured Ensign Burlingame's re-election. All of these pieces of connected tissue about how these folks are working together. In 1860, I love this, with the nomination of Abraham Lincoln, Lewis Hayden and Mark De Morty organized what was known as the West Boston Colored Wide Awakes. Okay, they've gone from this Free Soil Party, and they have 144 uniformed and equipped men. They are to parade and arouse an enthusiasm among all voters to assist in securing the election of our much beloved Abraham Lincoln. They were in it to win it. Now, Sumner's continuing and growing acquaintances and friendships with the black community are seen clearly in this following and final example. John Rock is born in Salem County, New Jersey in 1825. He attends school, becomes a teacher at the all-black public elementary school, and the school flourishes. But John Rock began studying medicine through libraries and private apprenticeships with white doctors. He's denied entrance to medical college, and he turns his attention to dentistry. Eventually, he is allowed to attend medical school and receives his degree from the American Medical College. In 1853, he and his wife moved to Boston, and he quickly becomes a leader in the abolitionist movement and is a favored speaker at the annual Crispus Attucks celebration at Faneuil Hall, declaring essentially that, quote, black is beautiful, long before the 60s. That is the 1960s. In 1858, Rock's health fails, and he must travel to Paris for the best medical care. But he's denied a passport by the Secretary of State. It is Sumner and the Massachusetts legislature that get Rock that passport. He finds out he's too ill to continue to practice medicine, so he reads and sits and studies for the bar, takes the bar, passes the bar, and becomes an attorney. A justice of the peace. And finally, John Rock then decides to seek support for his request to practice law before the United States Supreme Court from Senator Charles Sumner. Rock states that, quote, "I wrote to Senator Charles Sumner to ask for the favor of his influence in my behalf. We have a great and a good man for our new Chief Justice, anti-slavery activist Salmon Chase. And with him, I think my color will not be a bar to my admission. As you are acquainted with him, I will take the liberty to ask you to consult with him. I provide to you the list of references, including Massachusetts Governor Andrew." Now, Senator Sumner enclosed those references along with a letter. Sumner introduced the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, formally abolishing slavery. The day after the 13th Amendment was passed by the Congress, John Rock, the very next day, he says, after the United States House of Representatives passed the 13th Amendment, on Monday, February 1, 1865, I entered the chambers of the United States Supreme Court with Senator Charles Sumner. This is 1865. A New York Tribune reporter wrote about the ceremony, quote, "By Jupiter, the sight was grand. 'Twas dramatic, too. At 11, the procession of gowned judges entered the room with Chief Justice Chase at their head. The spectators and their lawyers in attendance rose respectfully on their coming. The Chief Justice, standing to the last, bowed with affable dignity to the bar and took his central seat with a great presence. Immediately, the senator from Massachusetts arose and in composed manner and quiet tone said, quote, 'May it please the court, I move that John S. Rock, a member of the Supreme Court of the state of Massachusetts, be admitted to practice as a member of this court,' end quote. Rock goes on, 'A clerk then came forward and administered the oath, making me the first Negro ever empowered to plead a case before the Supreme Court. I was also received on the floor of the House of Representatives, the first Negro attorney to be introduced to a session of Congress. These were the most glorious moments of my career.' I must mention that as Rock returned to Boston, he was arrested for traveling without a pass. Sumner was an unrelenting spokesperson for the anti-slavery movement in the Senate. I don't know. I should tell you that I came to Boston as a child and then as a college student, and I looked at the Common, and I always have looked at all of the statues. And I saw statues to white men, no surprise. But I didn't know who's put the statues there. I want you to understand that I have since learned that black abolitionists and activists wanted to acknowledge the contributions of Crispus Attucks, Wendell Phillips, William Lloyd Garrison, and Charles Sumner, among others, that they made certain that the monuments were erected to those who stood beside them in their fight for freedom and for this democracy. Tell everyone you know. Tweet about the sensational Senator Sumner.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Beverly, for those exhilarating talks. You're joining us at Cambridge Forum, listening to Daniel Coquillette and Beverly Morgan-Welch discussing Charles Sumner at 200, the tradition of civil rights in America. I'd like to start with a question for both of you. In your talks, you both emphasize the importance and the role of Charles Sumner's upbringing on Irving Street in this integrated neighborhood. To what degree do you think that that experience as a young boy and as a young man shaped the rest of his life as an activist trying to championing trying to champion black rights and equality before the law. And how do you think Sumner perceived Harvard, both the undergraduate and the law school, which was far, far wider than Irving Street, given that upbringing?
Well, I truly believe that growing up in that integrated community really formed him. Certainly, his father's beliefs were a part of that, but it was absolutely impossible. As you read about people walking the streets of Beacon Hill, the interactions, you see how closely knit it is. These black citizens knew whites of real power, and they helped to put them in those positions of power. So Sumner saw that going on. It wasn't a matter of simply passing along the way. The activities at the Meeting House alone, the lectures on gender equity, on infant daycare, to the radical abolitionist interactions were all a part of his upbringing. I mean, he is there from his beginnings, and as his father embraces this, I think it becomes much easier to understand it. And remember, there are pamphlets at the time that tell white people how to behave around black people. If you go into a restaurant and a black person is serving you, and you should never discuss slavery. And if you are discussing anything, you should look away. You know, I mean, these are written in a pamphlet. I mean, he's privy to all of that, what I assume he really believes is crazy behavior and really antithetical to everything that everybody's saying. I know that representatives from Harvard came to the African Meeting House, to the school. At times they were, they were entreated to come to help improve the educational opportunities there. It was, in fact, a part of the Boston public school system much earlier than building of the A.B.L. Smith School. So there are times that I'm sure that one's strategies don't necessarily align with your beliefs. That is, I need Harvard University to help out. I will swallow my pride today to get help for education on another day, and I think over the course of time he just becomes much less compromising. He's very clear, he's going to state what he's going to do, and he's going after it. He's taking no prisoners, and the same is true of Garrison.
Beverly raised in her talk, I'm sure that there are people out there asking this question. What happened to Burlingame after Preston Brooks challenged him to a duel, right? Beverly didn't finish that part of the story, right? And the answer is fascinating. Burlingame accepted, set a site just across the Canadian border on on the other side of Niagara Falls, and chose rifles. And Burlingame was a crack shot, and Preston Brooks reneged. So he was a coward through and through. The amazing thing about Charles Sumner was the way in which he was true to his neighborhood and his upbringing, but also managed through his elite connections, really gained by being a star student, to move with the elite of Europe. For 3 years, he took a time off and went and traveled in Germany and France and in England. He became fluent in French and German, Italian, and English. Lord Brunham said, "Wow, this is the most brilliant man we've ever seen." He had dinner with lords and ladies, which later turned out to be essential when the Union got in trouble with the British diplomacy. But this is a guy who passed in high society, but he never forgot his roots on Irving Street. Never.
That's great. Yes. Could you please state your name as you give your questions?
I'm Fred Small. I'm the senior minister of First Parish in Cambridge, Unitarian Universalist, this church. And I thank the panel so much for this indeed exhilarating presentation. The history of Unitarianism, as I'm sure the panel is aware, on matters of abolition and anti-slavery is checkered with some courageous individuals speaking out against slavery, and unfortunately not so much institutional support or even congregational support for the anti-slavery cause. And I fear that at the time of Charles Sumner's life, many of the members and leaders of this congregation were either sympathetic to or themselves lords of the loom. So I wonder, I'm curious about Charles Sumner's own religious life, if any. Where did he worship? Was he affiliated with any church or religious organization? And what was the quality of his spiritual life?
He went to King's Chapel. He had a pew in King's Chapel. Part of him was Episcopalian. But all of this, and John probably knows more than I do about this, but all of the established religions in Boston, and Unitarian was the established religion of Harvard, as you know, they were all torn. The conscience Whigs were people who were, disturbed about slavery. But it was one thing to be a conscience Whig and be disturbed about slavery, and to be an abolitionist, which means going into the South and wiping it out. I mean, the distinction's very simple. I mean, that's the distinction of the civil rights movement. I mean, it's one thing to be up here in Massachusetts and say we don't like segregation in Mississippi. It's something else to get on a bus and go down and try to stop it. And that was the division that he encountered. Only the Quakers were really radical, and as a Quaker myself, I will say most Quakers are nuts. So, anyway, I love them. But that was really the only group, and that group had a very strong tradition of leadership by women.
I like that very much. I know that Sumner, after by the time he graduated from Harvard, or soon after, he became a Unitarian. He was never a regular churchgoer. In fact, in his correspondence with Longfellow, and in numerous instances in Longfellow's journals, Longfellow will describe going to Unitarian church and asking Sumner if he wants to come, and Sumner saying, "No, I don't want to go." So he was, and there are a few specific instances in the 1840s and the 1850s where Sumner characterized himself as a heterodox Unitarian. So he had a clear understanding of the divinity. He disagreed with some of the doctrines of Unitarianism. From a religious standpoint, one of the crucial beliefs of Sumner was that he sought to act out God's injunction that God is no respecter of people, that in God's eyes everyone is equal, all humans are equal. He did, unlike most of the other abolitionists, though, the degree to which Sumner invoked God or Christ within his abolition rhetoric is fairly thin. It's fairly thin. He was, and I attribute that in part to his legal mind, he had such faith in the Declaration, the Constitution, and republicanism in the foundation of the United States as a nation that should be equal before the law, based on his upbringing, that religion, Unitarianism, the invocation of God was was not emphasized as much in his writings.
I do stand corrected by John. It was his family, his father, who had the pew at King's Chapel.
Yeah.
Yep.
Other questions?
I'm Bill Clendaniel. It's obviously very fitting that we spend much of the evening on the civil rights, because that's what most of us know Sumner. But for me, he takes on an even greater dimension, and Dan just began to allude to it, and maybe John is the one to tell us more about it. But he played a very, very significant role in the artistic life of Boston, and that's something that many people don't know about, and I would hate to have this celebration of this marvelous life not rounded out a little bit by what he contributed to the Athenaeum, to sculpture in America. I just think that makes him a much more, even more interesting person.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And he was, the arts in Boston are in part attributable to Charles Sumner. He was a huge patron. He was also extremely knowledgeable. In fact, Jim Shea gave me the pamphlet that Charles Sumner published of prints. He was an art historian, a vigorous art critic of prints, and collected them throughout his life. He was a huge patron. The Boston Athenaeum, the art at the Boston Athenaeum is in part where Sumner is, we can thank Sumner for much of it. And the art at the Boston Athenaeum, then much of it then was transferred to the Museum of the MFA Boston. And Sumner saw art. His love of art was actually similar to his love of law, his love of politics, his love of reform. They were all integrated. His love of poetry. He saw that, he believed that a virtuous Republican or democratic society was one in which the arts would flourish, the law would flourish, philanthropy would flourish, and they would all flourish to improve the human race in a way in which all humans were equal before the law, had an equality of opportunity, and it was a merit-based system for Sumner, which is why he was so horrified at slavery. His first description after he sees slaves at the late 1830s, he goes to Washington, D.C., and he visits Maryland. He sees slaves in the countryside. He's absolutely horrified because he understands that these are people who have been utterly denied the human right, in his mind, of education, of what the world has to offer. And his description and his outrage it brought tears to my eyes, literally, when I first read it.
I think that it is extremely important to see all of these players, Sumner especially, but these black abolitionists as well. The African Meeting House is alive with activity. There are operas, there are readings of books in the writing, plays in the making. It is sometimes hard to, initially it was just hard for me to imagine this kind of teeming cultural life in the midst of trying to end slavery. I mean, who has time? But clearly the understanding of the greatness that this nation could enjoy had a great deal to do with not only the freedoms, but the exploration and the elevating of a cultural life and a richness and a celebration. One year, the Marriage of Figaro, as presented at the African Meeting House, was touted as the best musical event in Boston. And I'm thinking, are you kidding me? You know, your anti-slavery meeting one day, and the next day, the Marriage of Figaro. Okay.
I'm Pat Zerke from Cambridge Forum.
I have two questions that are, I think, somewhat related. You've told us in very inspiring terms why we remember Charles Sumner, why we should remember Charles Sumner. Now I want you to tell us why we don't remember Charles Sumner. Why don't people know who the person in the statue outside the front door is? I think there's got to be an interesting story there. And then I'd like you to reflect on what difference long-term did his career make? How was the work of the people in the modern civil rights movement who had to retrace a lot of the steps that he had already taken? How was it changed? How was it set back? How was it put forward by his efforts in the 19th century?
There are still many people who will argue with you that the Civil War was not about slavery. There are people that continue to believe that Garrison, Sumner, chief among them, are people who exacerbated the problem, and they continue to speak negatively about how brash and harsh and difficult they were, as if putting up with slavery was a good idea. This debate has not ended. It continues on. The spin of the time was it wasn't about slavery, it was about states' rights, it was about a whole lot of other things, but it was not about slavery. And to continue this dialogue, I mean, as we look at celebrations of the sesquicentennial of the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation, some of what you will see and hear will make your head spin about how people present this history. I was looking at some old movies, and these are movies made in the 30s and 40s, and they were, in the movies they were talking about Garrison and Sumner as if the Civil War was yesterday, and, you know, watch Jezebel, you know, boy, they should, you know, they just go after Garrison. There, you know, these movies, Birth of a Nation is not the only movie that continues this kind of diatribe about how it is the cause of these activists, these radicals, that have torn the country apart. It's not about slavery. So elevating this man who is one of the greatest Americans to ever live, and certainly one of the greatest men I think the world has ever made, as John J. Smith said about William Lloyd Garrison, he's the greatest man America ever made. A lot of it still has to do with the debate that continues on, be it blue states or red states.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, the reason why Charles Sumner is not a household name in America is because what he stood for still has not come to pass. I mean, we still live in a society that is shackled by our past, and we're afraid to confront it in important ways. Now, let me give you an example. I mean, we live in a time when the idea, liberals say reasoned discourse, that's what we want, reasoned discourse. Everybody has a point of view. Let's listen to everybody's point of view. You know, everything is a matter of degree, right? My instructor at Harvard Law School said at one point when I made that argument that the difference between me and a virus was just a matter of degree. You know, there's right and wrong. I mean, we could talk about Guantanamo Bay, right? And you might think I was being pretty rude because I think it ought to be shut down. And we can talk about immigration policy, and we're going to have some disagreements. And the people that come on for the fundamental principles of right and wrong are not necessarily the popular politicians today, and just like they weren't in 1850 in Boston. So a lot of what keeps Sumner from being recognized for his true greatness is tied up in the problems we have right now in the country.
Just to add to that, in a very recent poll, given that we've just started the sesquicentennial of the Civil War, and a fairly accurate poll that's respected, the majority of Americans still believe that slavery was only incidental to the Civil War, that slavery was still a minor cause of the Civil War. And I think the best way to understand the Civil War is in the long view, which also helps to explain Sumner's status today, and that is that after Appomattox, the South Southerners surrender, but they don't quit fighting. They go back and they keep shooting blacks and Republicans until by the end of Reconstruction, they have essentially won the war. Because as every American, white and black, Northern and Southerner, understood in 1860 and 1861, the secession crisis and the Civil War was over slavery and black freedom. And by the end of Reconstruction, Southerners had essentially created a new order of black and freedom that most historians characterized as a form of serfdom, which was Jim Crow segregation that lasted until civil rights. And not only did Southerners win the war in that sense, but they also controlled the story of how the Civil War got told. And Sumner is someone who his colleagues in Congress, in the Senate and House, in large part to honor him, pass his Civil Rights Bill in 1875. Many of them, and I've gone through the records, many of them actually disagreed with the bill, felt that it was unconstitutional or had problems with it, but they pass it to honor him because they had such great respect for him. That reflects Sumner's democratic spirit. The idea that he's this unbending, shrill extremist contradicts, is absurd when you think of the respect accorded him in Congress as reflected in the Civil Rights Act that was passed in his honor in 1875, and an act that was as egalitarian, racially egalitarian, as Lyndon Johnson's Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965. And so in 1875, the majority of congressmen are honoring Sumner in a truly extraordinary, heroic way. By 1895, Sumner has already been demonized by most historians and most writers. And that demonization continues, as Daniel pointed out, right to this day. Sumner, in many respects, should be seen as the 19th century analog to Lyndon Johnson. Someone who, through his heroic efforts, was able, and his collaboration with African Americans, able to transform legally the nation. And I think that's important.
To address the second part of the question about its effect on the civil rights movement more recently, at the museum, right now we're restoring the African Meeting House. And the African Meeting House was really kind of rediscovered by Sue Bailey Thurman, the wife of the Reverend Dr. Howard Thurman, one of the greatest African-American theologians of the 20th century, if not the greatest. And they found this African Meeting House, then a Jewish synagogue on Beacon Hill. Now, it's the Thurmans who have a private audience with Mahatma Gandhi. And Gandhi has read Garrison. These things are all connected. And, of course, Martin Luther King's family know both Sue Bailey's family as they do the Reverend Dr. Howard Thurman, and of course he attends Boston University Theological Seminary. So we have here a connection in one place of these movements over the course of time and reading and connecting them. Very clearly, I think of Thurgood Marshall's speech I believe he was in Hawaii. And if you read that speech, and you read Sumner, and you read Douglass, and you read King, it is very hard to separate out these people and their movements. They are talking about the same thing. They are simply moving that movement forward.
Thank you. Is there any evidence that Johnson, for example, referred specifically to the work of Sumner when he was crafting his Civil Rights Act? Do you know?
That's a great question. I'm actually researching that right now. We do know that Johnson's aides, Johnson tried to hire what he considered to be the smartest people he could find to do research for him. And we know that Sumner's Civil Rights Bill and the act that was passed was a watered-down version that the Supreme Court then declares unconstitutional in 1883. We know that Johnson's aides drew heavily on Sumner's writings. The degree to which they did, and to the degree to which that influenced the Civil Rights Act of 1864 and the Voting Rights Act, I can't tell you right now because I've really only about a quarter of the way through that research. It's a great question, but I can point to a specific link, and I've also been able to follow up Beverly's wonderful point, to point to specific links between the leaders of the Civil Rights Movement, Martin Luther King Jr., Andrew Young, and the references that they make of Charles Sumner. Not as much as someone like Frederick Douglass, but they were familiar with Sumner. They were intimately familiar with what he had accomplished, and it's clear that his life and his work was a great source of inspiration for them.
Let me also say this. My parents are from a place called Eastman, Georgia, and when I was in high school and they were asking, so what'd you learn in school today? And they asked me, well, that's interesting, but do you know who W.E.B. Du Bois is? And I said, no. Do you know who Charles Sumner is? No. Well, they went to all black schools, as did Martin Luther King Jr. and others. And so Sumner was an important part of the history that they learned about this country. It's very interesting. They had a whole list of people, and they kept saying, well, we thought we were getting you a better education in Connecticut. And you don't know any of the most important people that are the greatest heroes and why we're even here. And, but again, they went to all black schools and were taught about this history in a very different way.
In fact, in the research I've done among African Americans after Sumner's death, the two whites who are most beloved by African Americans of the Civil War era are John Brown and Charles Sumner. And they also happen to be the two men who have been most demonized by white Southerners throughout the 20th century. There is to this day a folk song called I'll Be John Brown that's sung in the South. And so instead of saying I'll be hanged or I'll be bleep damned, they'll say I'll be John Brown. And Sumner occupies, in a sense, the same circle of hell as John Brown in the white Southern imagination. The reverse is that African Americans, if there are two white freedom fighters and civil rights activists that they know of from the 19th century, it's John Brown and Charles Sumner.
I'm Fred Meyer. I'm wondering if Sumner or you saw or see any way that slavery could have been eliminated short of war. What's making me think of this is I ran across a privately printed 1860 book printed by a medical doctor who essentially was saying this: I see two groups in this country, and they both have a point. They're the abolitionists who say slavery is wrong and immoral, and of course they're right. And then there's the Southerners who say, well, we've invested a lot of money in our slaves, our economy is built up on it, and they have a point too. And what we ought to do is buy the slaves and then free them. Sort of eminent domain, and that raises a lot of problems because the federal government wasn't strong enough to do that at the time. But were there any approaches that any of these leaders came up with, short of simply asking Southern slave owners to give them up voluntarily? Were there movements along that line of compensating them in some way for the greater good? Or was it so polarized that rather than compromise, people would rather kill one another?
Great question. One of the other ways in which the abolitionists in general have been demonized or misrepresented is in describing them as shrill and extremists and on the fringe. The accusation is that they refuse to compromise, that they refuse to try to negotiate with Southern slave owners, which is patently wrong. Throughout the abolition era, and especially in the early period until 1830s, compensated emancipation was the model for all of the northern states to end slavery. And until the 1860s, numerous abolitionists sought to enter into a conversation with Southerners about compensated emancipation. Most white abolitionists, before they became abolitionists or immediate abolitionists, had been colonizationists, meaning that they advocated gradual emancipation, compensation to masters, and colonizing blacks in another country. Sumner never did. Sumner never endorsed colonization. He stands virtually alone among abolitionists, among white abolitionists of his time period, in never passing through that colonizationist scheme. But a number of anti-slavery advocates and abolitionists sought to enter into discussion with Southerners, offering compensated emancipation, some offering colonization with their goal of eventual emancipation. White Southerners, beginning in the 1830s, refused to negotiate. In fact, the easiest way to characterize the South, the Southern states beginning in the 1830s, is that it's a closed society. Following Nat Turner's Rebellion in 1831, following the publication of William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator that same year, and the brilliant proliferation of abolitionist pamphlets inundating Congress with petitions, with anti-slavery petitions, Southerners essentially decided we will not tolerate any discussion, any debate about slavery. And they essentially repealed the constitutional freedoms of speech, debate, petition, and assembly from 1830, in essence, until 1960s. Now, that's an exaggeration, but that's a way to frame it.
I've been studying the minutes of the assembly of Harvard law students that met right across the street here in the 1850s. At that time, Harvard Law School had about 25% Southern students. One of the things that's not fully appreciated about Harvard Law School is that it graduated 8 Confederate major generals, 18 brigadier generals, and 16 colonels, and 50 Harvard Law School students died fighting for the Confederacy. It was actually a major source of leadership, second only to West Point. So you have law students, including Charles Sumner, with a debating society. After the first 2 years, they had to take the debates about slavery off the agenda. In the 1850s, it was out of order to debate any of these issues. And the real reason for it, as John says, is that slavery had become absolutely at the core of Southern economics and Southern life. The problem wasn't that it was shrinking or diminishing within the Deep South, as many had hoped, but it was spreading with increased vigor into Arkansas, into Texas, into Missouri. The institution was growing, and that is what Sumner saw so clearly, And it's that more than anything else that made compromise about slavery impossible.
I mean, up until a point, this idea of balance, a slave state and a free state, is maintained. And then this, take no prisoners, we will do as we will, this is about money. We own people, those people produce products, they run the agrarian culture, and they are worth, at a time, just in terms of cotton, the majority of the gross national product of the United States of America. So you're talking about people powering the economy, and you're talking about people's economic assets. And on the other hand, you have a group of people saying everyone has a right to their freedoms. Part of the abolitionist movement was very much an appeal to people's Christian principles and beliefs, that slavery was simply wrong. And I believe it's Samuel May who says that he's standing outside of an anti-slavery meeting in New York, and someone who is a Northerner who has considerable holdings in the South comes up to him and says, you know what? We know it's wrong. You know, we're not stupid. We're not crazy. We know this is wrong. But I'm going to tell you, you mess with my money, and we'll take you down. I mean, it's as simple as that. I mean, he can't believe it. He really thinks that these anti-slavery activists and the abolitionists are really making a whole lot more of people becoming just, intransigent. I mean, they just won't change their position. They won't open up. And this becomes now, this is the way we're going to do it. We're going to take over more property. We're going to move forward with slavery. And I would remind us that Strom Thurmond's story is Thomas Jefferson's story. The story isn't any different. It's the 20th century. There are all of these, held beliefs, and, everybody knew about Strom Thurmond's daughter. Certainly the black community knew, the white community knew. But to keep that off of the national screen, because he took care of her, it's a bliss, he paid for her upbringing, sent her to college, saw her once in a while. What's the problem? And there are very deep and wide problems about that. But always the idea is to tell the lie. They are uncompromising. They are the ones who have made this happen. Certainly, they tried for quite some time. The first enslaved person is recorded here in Boston in 1638. Believe me, they were trying to get free peacefully for quite some time.
And one of the other ways in which the story of the Civil War era was revised over the course of the late 19th century and throughout most of the 20th century, still believed by a number of people today, is that slavery was a dying institution. Southerners were on the defensive. It was not profitable. If you went south, they were being oppressed and exploited by these northern capitalists and industrialists, whereas we now know that 2/3 of the wealthiest Americans were slave owners. Without question, the vast majority of millionaires in the United States were slave owners. The average price of a prime field hand, meaning a man or a woman age 20 to 40 in the 1850s, was worth today what a top-of-the-line Mercedes would be. That's one slave. The rough parallel in money would be $75,000. And many planters owned hundreds, even thousands of slaves. I mean, they were truly big businessmen. Slavery was the nation's first big business. And so there was this vested interest in not only preserving it, but expanding it.
Hi, I'm Karen Klinger. While Sumner is not a household name today, his friend on the right there, Longfellow, certainly is. And I wonder if any of you could talk a little bit about how the two of them interacted or talked about the issue of slavery and abolition. I thought about this the other day when I read that Jill Lepore, a historian at Harvard, has suggested that Paul Revere's Ride, which was published 4 months before the Civil War broke out, has a subtext to it that Longfellow was making a point not about the Revolutionary War, but the war that was about to break out in his own time.
Jim Shea, my dear friend, said before this session, he said, you know, Longfellow had an extraordinary ability in choosing the right friends. I mean, he did. He appreciated, none of us up here are suggesting that Sumner was easy to get along with. And Longfellow not only, made allowance for his friend, but backed him up when things were really tough. I have a great admiration for Longfellow as a part of the flowering of New England that Van Wyck Brooks has written about. But it's amazing the friends that Longfellow had. And Sumner was one of his, real sharp choices.
And I would say that Sumner and Longfellow were kindred spirits in their hatred and their opposition to slavery. Longfellow loved and supported every single one of Sumner's anti-slavery speeches. And Longfellow published Poems on Slavery in 1842, which was a brilliant book of anti-slavery poems for which he was vigorously criticized by people, not only the cotton Whigs in Massachusetts, but throughout the nation. Longfellow at the time was the preeminent poet at a time in which poets were accorded far more respect than they are today. Longfellow, though, had a very different disposition. He did not feel comfortable in a kind of acrimonious public sphere that Sumner did. Longfellow did not feel confident or comfortable in debating, and following the Poems on Slavery, he started writing poems, historical poems. And I completely agree with Jill Lepore's point that the historical poetry that he wrote had everything to do with his present moment, that is, the 1850s, and was they were in its own way as abolitionist, as endorsing of freedom and equality before the law as his anti-slavery poems were. And Sumner and Longfellow's differences, one the politician, one the poet, they had great respect for each other's profession. Part of Sumner wanted to be a poet. Part of Longfellow wanted to be an anti-slavery and abolitionist politician.
Well, now I want to go out and find out more about Charles Sumner. Can you recommend a biography, or do we have to wait for John's? And if so, how long must we wait?
The best biography, there's a superb biography by Emory Taylor, which is on it's called The Young Charles Sumner, published by University of Massachusetts Press. It's an academic biography. It's superb because it's really the first person since Pierce, who had been a friend of Sumner, to write a sympathetic portrait of Sumner, and it came out about 7 or 8 years ago. It ends right before Sumner even goes to Congress. And so it's only a slice of his life, but her analysis and her story and her research on Sumner's early life is superb. I think the best full biography of Charles Sumner is still Pierce's 4 volumes. It is truly stunning.
In other words, if you want to find out what happened after he went to Congress, you have to wait for John's book.
The goal is to have it out before the end of the sesquicentennial. The Sumner papers are absolutely just vast, and the more that I'm immersed, the more that I realize how influential and important Sumner's anti-slavery friends and colleagues have been, and they are themselves voluminous writers and beautiful writers. And so I've now gone through all of Sumner's outgoing correspondence, which is itself a huge, thousands and thousands of letters. Have been going through Longfellow's. I have all of Longfellow's letters to Sumner. Samuel Gridley Howe is another very close friend who was one of the Secret Six conspirators of John Brown's raid. But I haven't really gone in depth yet in Sumner's Civil War and Reconstruction period. His own writings are 15 volumes. I mean, he was a true intellectual, and there's no way, if I were doing it by myself, it would be 10 years. I mean, Sally and I are really working full-time on this, and we hope to have it out by the end of the sesquicentennial, and that's the goal. I have one more point that I would like to just make about Beverly's wonderful story of Sumner in 1858 getting a passport for John Rock. It's such a beautiful and poignant moment because, as most of you know, the idea of citizenship in the United States, the idea of being a citizen isn't codified until the 14th Amendment. Before the 14th Amendment, who was included as a citizen was up for debate. And one of the criteria of citizenship was a passport. It's why so many politicians or secretaries of state wanted to deny blacks citizenship or passports, because particularly after Dred Scott, in which Chief Justice Taney declares that blacks have never been and could never be citizens, which is historically false. Blacks had received passports throughout American history. For Sumner to get Rock a passport is for Sumner to say, not just John Rock, but John Rock is symbolic of all African Americans who have the inalienable right to be citizens based on the nation's laws. And to extend that for just a second, Sumner understood, as just about every free black who I've read in Boston and elsewhere in the North understood, is that free blacks also were a key to emancipation. Because one of the reasons why so many white Americans wanted to colonize blacks or keep them enslaved is because of their racist views that African Americans could not be citizens. Same with women. Women could not, they didn't have the capacity to assume the duties of a citizen. And so one of the reasons why Sumner advocated education, was a champion of the arts, is because he understood, and African Americans free blacks understood, that one of the best ways to fight against slavery and racism is to out-citizen white citizens.
And one of the amazing things about Sumner is that he was one of the first advocates for free, full citizenship for Asian Americans. The Chinese Exclusion Acts were racist, and they said, and right up until the late 1930s, said that if you were a Mongoloid race, you could not be an American citizen. So, I mean, he was on top of that one in the 1850s.
Hi, my name is Eric Hansen, and I'm curious exactly how Charles Sumner was able to maintain his office in the Senate while being such a radical individual. I mean, I know at this point the Senate was not popularly elected directly by individual people in each state, but I know there would be quite a bit of opposition to what he stood for. So I'm interested, how was he elected? How did he hold office so long?
I had the opportunity on several occasions to visit Senator Kennedy's office, and I liken it to the same thing, that there's a point at which, whatever your beliefs, however radical they may be to the mainstream, there is a great deal of kind of honor paid to one's ability to be a great senator and a great statesman. And you can argue about the differences between the two, but in fact, watching people go in and out of the office, people who vehemently disagreed with him, there was certainly a great deal of respect for the way in which he conducted his business as a senator. And I think that the passage of the Civil Rights Act was indeed that kind of acknowledgement. They may have vehemently disagreed, but the way in which this person upheld their views, honestly debated them, forthrightly held to his convictions, all of those things got him the respect at the time that he was due.
Well, you know, after he's beaten by Preston Brooks, he couldn't serve for 3 years, and instead of replacing him, they just left the state, reelected him, and left the empty seat there because it was so important a statement of Massachusetts' respect for Sumner and what he stood for.
And just to echo what Dan and Beverly said, is that, I mean, Sumner, while he was a senator, from the time he first became senator in the early 50s through it started to dwindle off in the Civil War, he received regular death threats from around the country. So had John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams, while he's serving in the House of Representatives, the former president is receiving regular death threats. But because of their mastery and the command of the parliamentary process, their knowledge of, their deep, deep knowledge of the Constitution, the laws, the original intentions, and the language of the nation's founding documents, they were accorded enormous respect. So there's a huge gap between how their fellow politicians regarded them, even though they vehemently disagreed with them, and how the rank and file pro-slavery Americans regarded them or accorded them. And this is true not just with Sumner, but with John Quincy Adams, as I said, Thaddeus Stevens, Joshua Giddings, Gerrit Smith, all of them abolitionist congressmen. You've been listening to a program of Cambridge Forum, recorded in May 2000, co-sponsored by the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters National Historic Site, the Friends of the Longfellow House, the Lowell Institute, and the Friends of Cambridge Forum. For more information about this radio program entitled Charles Sumner at 200, The Tradition of Civil Rights in America, featuring Beverly Morgan-Welch and Daniel Coquillette, or about our ongoing radio series and Forum Network webcasts, visit us on the web at cambridgeforum.org in Harvard Square. I'm John Stauffer, and thank you very much for joining us.